In the early 500s, Japan was little more than a loose confederation of clans, with an emperor who was merely the nominal chief of the chieftains who led those various clans. But beginning in the late 500s, leaders in Japan embarked on an unprecedented project of state building. And by the late 700s, Japan was a highly centralized state, with an emperor who claimed direct authority over all Japanese territory. This was also an ambitious state that described itself as equal to the Chinese Empire. Today we'll talk about the how and the why of this remarkable change. But before we dive into those details, let me make an important note about periodization. In most encyclopedia entries or in textbooks on Japan, you will probably find ancient Japanese history broken into 3 distinct periods. First, there's the Asuka period, which runs from 538 to 710 CE. Then comes the Nara period, which runs from 710 to 794 CE. And that's followed by the Heian period, which runs from 794 to 1185 CE. Each of those names, Asuka, Nara, and Heian, are place names, based on the site of the imperial capital during the period in question. And all 3 sites are in the same general region. Heian today is known as Kyoto, and the older capital of Nara is just 25 miles to the south, and the still older capital of Asuka is another 18 miles to the south. So today we'll be talking about politics in the Asuka, the Nara, and the early Heian periods. And by way of introduction, let's imagine a set of before and after shots for different aspects of Japan. And let's start with a snapshot of politics and economics. So in the 500s, each clan leader governed his own people under his own rules. Commoners paid tribute to local clan leaders. Taxes and ritual offerings were likely fused into one form of tribute. Local lords and local gods were connected, so taxes and tithing were the same. That's our before picture. Now for the after picture. By the end of the 8th century, Japan had a single monarch in Kyoto whose laws applied throughout Japan. This new state wiped out clan boundaries, and at least in theory, the new state counted every person in Japan. It conducted a census that listed the family status of every person and measured all the land in Japan. The new state tried to fit all the arable land in Japan into a neat rectangular grid. Moreover, the central government tried to redistribute all the land in Japan every 6 years so that every adult male commoner had the exact same parcel as every other adult male commoner. And every adult male servant had the exact same size parcel as every other adult male servant. And every adult female commoner had the exact same parcel size as every other adult female commoner. And so on. This was based loosely on Chinese practices, but in Japan, it was an unprecedented new level of national power. Historians call this new centralized monarchy the Ritsuryo state. The term Ritsuryo refers to a system of imperial law that in theory applied to every village in Japan. The system was comprised of 2 main components: the criminal law, or Ritsu, and the administrative laws, or Ryo. Okay, let's move from political and economic questions to military affairs. In the 500s, armies consisted of small bands of clan leaders and their followers. In the 700s, by contrast, the centralized government tried to draw conscripts from every village in Japan and to create a large national army. How about cities? In the 500s, there were no cities worth mentioning in Japan. The capital cities in the Asuka region were little more than clusters of official buildings. But by the 700s, Japan began building major cities. First, the imperial seat was established in the capital of Nara, and then to an even larger city in Kyoto, also known as Heian-kyo, and that became the official capital in 794. Both of these were carefully planned, neat rectangular cities with a tidy grid of streets running north-south and east-west. Kyoto was based closely on Chang'an, the ancient capital of several Chinese dynasties today known as Xi'an, and it was more massive than anything before in Japan, measuring roughly 3 miles on each side. And even today, the layout of Kyoto reflects that old grid. And it's worth noting, as an aside, that the layout of Kyoto is in striking contrast to Tokyo. There's no clear grid in Tokyo. Instead, streets in Tokyo form a spiderweb pattern around the imperial palace. And that reflects the origins of Tokyo as a samurai castle town. If you're lost in Tokyo, that's kind of the plan. Think of yourself as part of an attacking army. The more lost you are, the better. In fact, the current imperial palace at the center of Tokyo was, until 1868, the shogun's castle. And you can still see traces today of the old moat. By contrast, it's almost impossible to get lost in Kyoto, since the city is in such a neat grid. The streets are even numbered. After First Avenue comes Second Avenue, and then Third Avenue. It's a very different sense of power. Nice straight lines show how the emperor can impose order and structure on the universe. Okay, how about a before and after shot of religion? Well, in the 500s, Buddhism was virtually unknown in Japan. But in the 700s, the state actively embraced and promoted Buddhism, which had reached the country via Chinese monks. In fact, the imperial government built a monastery in every provincial capital. And in the 750s, the state completed one of the largest Buddhist temples in the world, Todaiji in Nara. Even today, the main hall at Todaiji, the Great Buddha Hall, is one of the largest wooden structures in the world. And what's inside the Great Buddha Hall is even more impressive. The world's largest bronze statue of the Buddha, known in Japan as the Daibutsu. The creation of that Buddha statue was a massive technological feat. It's nearly 50 feet tall and weighs 500 tons. The feat itself points to the central government's new ability to gather and deploy prodigious resources, both human and economic. Okay, we've looked at several before and after snapshots of ancient Japan, and they all show a dramatic change that occurred in the space of a mere 200 years, from the 500s to the 700s CE. So here's the big question: why? What prompted Japanese leaders to undertake these massive political, military, and religious projects, most of which were inspired by foreign models? Well, to answer that question, we first have to grasp one fundamental point. The transformation of ancient Japan only makes sense in a broader international context, because Japanese centralization was part of a bigger transnational process, the rise of powerful states in China and Korea. And I think it's useful to consider this in terms of globalization. We can call this ancient globalization, because, as we noted in an earlier lecture, we see similar processes more than 1,000 years later, in the 1800s and 1900s. Now, here's the big parallel. In both eras, first in the 500s to the 700s, and then again in the 1800s and the 1900s, Japan faced a new challenge: an enormous, powerful, and expansive foreign culture. In the ancient period, that foreign culture was China, the Sui dynasty, and then the Tang dynasty. In the modern world, it was the great Western powers, the US, Britain, France, and later Germany. But in both cases, Japanese leaders responded in similar ways. First, with the massive adoption of Chinese ideas and technologies, and then, more than 1,000 years later, with the massive adoption of European and American ideas and technologies. So let's take a closer look at the factors that shaped Japan's ancient experiment with globalization. Let's get into some of the details of geopolitics in ancient East Asia. What was going on in China and Korea that so intimidated the rulers of the Japanese islands? In short, it's the return of a unified China. The first big Chinese dynasty was the Han, but that collapsed in the 200 CE. And over the next 300 years, China was ruled by multiple rival kingdoms, over a dozen kingdoms in the 4th century. Then that consolidated to 3 in the 500s, the Chen in the south, the Zhou in the northwest, and the Qi in the northeast. In the late 500s, however, the Sui dynasty consolidated and ruled much of the area that's now called China. The Sui lasted only to 618 CE, but the Sui was followed by the Tang dynasty, which endured for 3 centuries. Tang emperors were at the helm of a powerful, stable, expansive Chinese empire. Now, at a basic level, this Chinese unification inspired Japanese unification. The Tang dynasty in East Asia was like Rome in Europe, unprecedented in its cultural sophistication, art, culture, technology, and also unprecedented in its military prowess. So it was both a positive model of what a state could be and a terrifying threat. The threat to Japan was quite tangible because in the 7th century CE, Tang China intervened close by on the Korean peninsula, and that served as a catalyst for centralizing authority in Japan. You see, in the 500s, there had been 4 kingdoms on the Korean peninsula: Shilla, Baekje, Goguryeo, and the Gaya Confederacy. But in the 600s, Tang China helped Shilla defeat all other rival kingdoms and become the ruling dynasty of the entire peninsula. This was seen as a serious threat in Japan, especially because Japan was associated with the losing sides, loosely with the Gaya Confederacy and Goguryeo, and much more closely with the kingdom of Baekje. In fact, Japanese noble families and Baekje noble families had deep connections through intermarriage and immigration. So when the Tang dynasty interfered on behalf of Shilla, this was a double threat. Not only was the Tang fighting against the relatives of Japanese nobles, but what would happen if the Tang won? Would they then move on to Japan? So it's against this backdrop of Chinese intervention in Korea that we can really appreciate Japan's dilemma. In essence, a movement towards greater centralized state authority was necessary to deal with a perceived threat from the continent. Now, as we've seen, Japan was really not a unified country in the 500s. Rather, it was a loose confederation of clans struggling for control. And in this environment of battling rival clans, one ambitious house came to the fore: the Soga clan. The Soga were connected to Baekje and to Goguryeo and the Gaya Confederacy. They claimed descent from the legendary Japanese Emperor Kogen, but also from Korean nobles. And crucially, the Soga made no attempt to hide this. Their palace in Japan was called Kudara, which is the Japanese word for Baekje, and they brought over nobles from Baekje to serve as officials in Japan. Now, having gained the upper hand among rival clans in Japan, the Soga were committed to the task of building a stronger central state. And for political models, the Soga looked to China. In addition, they aggressively promoted foreign culture, especially Buddhism. And they were involved in building some of the earliest Buddhist temples in Japan. That drew stiff opposition from other Japanese clans, in particular from the Mononobe and the Nakatomi clans. Those clans were indignant about this foreign influence. In one instance, they supposedly threw a Buddhist statue into a river and burned down one of the Soga temples. And so the Soga responded with force. In 587 CE, they crushed the Mononobe and the Nakatomi in a palace coup. And in 592, they assassinated the emperor. But the Soga decided not to make themselves emperors, but instead to rule through pliant proxies. They married their daughters to emperors, and then they served as high-ranking ministers. But Soga men themselves did not claim the throne. In that capacity, the Soga wielded great influence during the Asuka period, and they effectively drove the great transformation of Japanese society that we've been talking about today, the creation of a centralized Japanese state based on Chinese models. The continental influence was evident everywhere. For example, the Soga introduced a system of court ranks that was almost identical to the system found in Sui China and Baekje Korea. You might think of this as a rudimentary civil service, with grades for each level of rank. These new court ranks trumped older clan titles, and these ranks weren't just numeric, they were named for moral qualities. First was virtue, then benevolence, and then propriety. So a continental moral philosophy, both Buddhist and Confucian, was actually built into the administrative hierarchy of the Asuka period. Now the Soga were importing Chinese ideas partly to press back against China. Remember how the Sui dynasty had looked down on Pimiko? She was just a shaman queen who sent tribute to the great and Chinese civilized empire? Well, the Soga pushed back. They began insisting that the Japanese king was the equal of the Chinese king. In fact, they were both emperors. And the Japanese sent a diplomatic note to the Sui that was both polite and obnoxious. It stated that the emperor, the son of heaven, of the land of the rising sun, was sending his warmest greetings to the emperor of the land of the setting sun. Now the Soga maintained power for about 60 years, and they were tough. They assassinated their rivals. But in 645, they themselves were overthrown in a coup led by their old enemies, the Nakatomi. Okay, let's think back about this for a moment. Back in the 580s, the Nakatomi had opposed the Soga over the question of Buddhism as a foreign religion. So it would be reasonable to assume that they would reverse the Soga reforms after driving them from power, right? In fact, the opposite happened. The Nakatomi doubled down on continental-style reforms, and they accelerated the process of building a powerful centralized state. And the question is why? Why would clans that had opposed Buddhism and foreigners from Baekje in the 500s now endorse importing continental ideas and technologies? Well, here are two answers. First, cynically. Has any government ever aggressively reduced its own power? When the Nakatomi grabbed the makings of a powerful centralized state from the Soga, why would they want to return to a system where a chieftain's power was limited to his own clan? Second, back on the continent, remember that civil war in Korea? Well, the Tang dynasty is intervening right next door. They are backing Shilla against Baekje. And despite their distrust of the Soga clan, the Nakatomi were unwilling to abandon Japanese allies on the continent. In fact, the son of the Baekje king had fled to Japan. So the mid-600s are a very bad time to argue in favor of a weak central state and in favor of a loose confederation of clans. Unfortunately, when Japan tried to help Baekje against Shilla, they got clobbered. Japan sent troops, they sent the army, they sent the navy. Supposedly, according to ancient chronicles, they sent over 30,000 men and 800 ships. But they were crushed. In a major battle in 663, the Battle of Hakushinoe, they lost half the fleet. and tens of thousands of men. Now, this development was genuinely terrifying. The Nakatomi must have been asking themselves, what if the Tang-Shilla alliance decides to attack Japan? So defeat in Korea actually helped inspire a massive centralization of power, and even more emulation of continental models. Okay, with this historical background in mind, let's go back to those before and after snapshots. Remember how I mentioned that the imperial state tried to compile a massive administrative code governing supposedly all of Japan, all the land, all people, everyone and everything? That makes a lot of sense if we think of a context involving frantic international rivalry. Now, as it turns out, the invasion from the continent never came. But that army that the central government had raised, well, it proved pretty useful nonetheless. The imperial state used it to expand its power on the Japanese archipelago. In the early 600s, most of Japan northeast of present-day Tokyo was wild frontier. Fukushima, for example, the site of the 2011 nuclear disaster, that would have been considered wild frontier in the early 600s. But over the next 200 years, the imperial court pushed its control almost to the northern edge of Honshu, pushed the border north about 300 miles. Meanwhile, to the southwest, the imperial state extended its control over all of Kyushu. Now this raises the question, who was on the other side of the border? Were they politically different, culturally different, physically different? Quite frankly, we really don't know for sure. In the northeast, the so-called barbarians were known as Emishi, and they may be related to the present-day Ainu, and therefore physiologically close to the Caucasian peoples of Siberia and the Amur River Basin. In the southwest, the barbarians were called the Hayato. There, the difference was probably more cultural and political than physical. In any case, whether they were called Emishi or Hayato, barbarian meant people who did not grow rice and did not pay taxes on that rice to the central state. But with the expansion of the imperial state, by the 800s, the capital in Kyoto was actually getting tax revenue from almost everywhere in the three main islands of Japan, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. This had a permanent impact on Japanese culture. Here's a good example. The ancient system of highways set up to collect taxes from distant corners of the empire, those names survive in the Japanese railway system. If you take the bullet train from Tokyo to Osaka or Kyoto, that line is called the Tokaido line. That's the name for the ancient imperial highway that connected the capital to the northeastern frontier. Now, even though the Chinese invasion never came, the emerging Japanese state was still determined to impress its neighbors with displays of power. Now today, if a country wants to do that, the pattern is that you show your technological and economic ascendance by hosting the Olympics. Tokyo in 1964, Seoul in 1988, Beijing in 2008. They were all used to show off the wealth and power of the host countries. But how do you impress the world in the 740s without an International Olympic Committee? Well, the Japanese state decided to build Todaiji Temple. Emperor Shomu was determined to build the biggest Buddhist temple in the world. Biggest outer building, biggest Buddha image. And this really was at the outer limits of Japanese technological ability. According to ancient records, the temple employed 50,000 master woodworkers, over 300,000 smiths and metalworkers, and 2 million ordinary laborers. Now, these have to be exaggerated numbers because the total population of Japan was probably only 4 to 6 million in the 8th century CE. But even so, it was an enormous undertaking. Casting the bronze Buddha alone took multiple efforts. The opening ceremony for Todaiji Temple was attended by monks and officials from around the known world, from Shilla, from Tang China, from Southeast Asia, and from South Asia. A monk from India officially consecrated the Buddha. His name is recorded as Bodhisenya. Now, setting aside the idea that Emperor Shomu was very devout, this massive expenditure makes sense primarily in terms of something like the Olympic Games. Expensive, peaceful propaganda designed to impress an international audience. You build huge, expensive buildings, you invite guests from around the world, and the goal was partly just to send people home saying, wow, what a show! I had no idea that they could stage such an elaborate opening ceremony, that they could build such a big stadium, or cast such a big statue. And that's a good closing note for the 8th century. The Japanese elite was determined to impress their nation's power and sophistication upon Asia, which for them was the rest of the world. And being sophisticated meant, in many ways, emulating Buddhism and Confucianism, the philosophies of the continent. And so just like hosting the Olympics, it meant showing off, but in a cosmopolitan fashion. And also, like hosting the Olympics, mounting these impressive projects can be unsustainable. A government can look back at their massive construction projects just a decade later and wonder, we ran up a debt for that? And that's a good perspective on the legacy of the ancient imperial state, the Ritsuryo state. On the one hand, Ritsuryo law in Japan was like Roman law in Europe. It continued to have an influence long after the empire was gone. In fact, the official titles of the Ritsuryo system remained in use until the 1800s. But many of the achievements of the Ritsuryo state began to feel unsustainable rather quickly. They made sense only in terms of furious international competition. So don't just think of a huge Olympic stadium that begins to seem like a waste of money a few years after the Games. Think of how the space race was connected to the Cold War. The Russians were the first to put a man in orbit, so the US had to be the first to put a man on the moon. And it was a remarkable achievement. And then, to the dismay of NASA and fans of space exploration, support for the program began to fade after the first lunar landing. Or think of the level of national unity and national mobilization that happens when a country feels threatened. All sorts of domestic conflicts get buried, and everyone buys war bonds. And then the threat passes, and well, things return to normal. Now, many aspects of the Ritsuryo state were like that. Projects that made sense during a period of national crisis and intense rivalry, but they simply lost support after the crisis was over. So remember how all the land in Japan was supposed to be redistributed every 6 years? And remember how Japan built a national army based on conscription? Well, that made sense if you expect an invasion and you want a massive national army, or if you were determined to impress neighboring countries by hosting the 8th century version of the Olympics. But then the invasion didn't come, and the Olympics were over. And you have a tax burden so heavy that farmers keep running away, and your army is plagued by desertion because farmers don't want to be drafted. The great accomplishments of the Ritsuryo state began to look unnecessary and unsustainable. You can't keep a country on a permanent wartime footing, and you can't host the Olympic Games every 4 years. So by the late 800s, the imperial elite, the courtiers around the emperor, they began to wonder whether this massive central government was worth the effort. Well, we'll return to those courtiers and to the fate of the Ritsuryo system in a later lecture.